Today we are checking out the various ports of Rastan Saga, or just Rastan as it is more commonly known as. The arcade original by Taito, granted, hasn't gone down as a classic hack and slash title with better arcade games out there, but it's likely a game you had as a kid whether you liked it or not. Everybody seems to have their own stories of a particular version of this game. The game itself is of course set in a mystical fantasy world, very similar to something like Conan the Barbarian in theme. And of course the 1980s had its fair share of muscle men wanting a piece of success, where Arnold Schwarzenegger had it with Conan. Personally, I loved the Red Sonja as a kid, but that's another story. The Rastan ports were mainly published by Imagine for the computer side, and Sega published the console versions, which was both Master System and the Sega Game Gear. Now let me just give you a heads up, there isn't going to be any homebrew versions, that's aftermarket versions, such as the Amiga version, which is going to be released at some point soon. We hope this is going to be looking at every original port from back in the day, so here we go. Most of you who knows the different versions of Rastan very likely knew that this would be the worst of all versions, the godforsaken Commodore 64 version by Imagine. I had this game on its Hit Squad label, which my mum and dad bought with the C64 for Christmas 1990. It got played quite a lot over time, and just like the C64 port of Robocop, Rastan was a broken mess for more than just one reason. Watch Rastan's feet as I walk across the mountains. His feet doesn't even touch the floor, and every now and again a swarm of bats will attack you, leaving you no time at all to defend yourself. Enemies will walk across water whilst it gives you instant death. The cherry on the cake here is the infamous castle stage, where it is near impossible, if not totally impossible, to cross the ropes. It is unnecessarily difficult to play. Enemies will deplete your energy more than other versions will. Collision detection is very bad in this too. I later realised later in life how truly bad this version was when I seen how it was supposed to look in play. An absolute joke of a game, and Martin Galway, who composed the music, likely was ashamed to have his name stamped on this ridiculous nonsense. So where do I start with this little Amstrad CPC port, which likely caused so much anger with its utterly trashy gameplay? Well, I'll begin with climbing ropes. As you will see in the footage, Rastan doesn't have a sprite designed to climb. Instead, he kind of awkwardly jumps up. Just a very bizarre look. Now, for those who have never seen this version, you'll likely be more concerned about the ridiculously slow frame rate. Yes, damn, this port is slow, likely going at 1 FPS maximum. Now, in other versions, including the arcade game, we can bash a block to jump down into the first cave to grab a new weapon. Not here though, you can simply just drop down, saving Mr. Rastan some energy for battling more evildoers. You will also notice that weapons are concealed within boxes here rather than having a sprite that looks like the weapon. Collision detection is pretty good, and the blood splatter of enemies look pretty smart too, but dear lord, the slow pacing is unbearable with this game. I died around 3/4 of the way in after around 4 minutes of gameplay to end up back at the start. At that point I had enough and just turned it off. Would I recommend the Amstrad CPC conversion? I would rather recommend Ping Pong, as that game offered more entertainment value. Call me strange, but I have always been fond of the ZX Spectrum port. In fact, it is likely my favourite here, if I am honest with you. If you didn't grow up with a ZX Spectrum like I did, you can learn to appreciate it, or just write it off as a British budget computer of the 1980s. Give it some time and you'll learn to appreciate it just like I did. Although colours are an issue here and can be sometimes hard to see enemies and projectiles when things like colour clash happen with backgrounds, this is surprisingly fun and fairly speedy game to play. It's got perfect collision detection and spot on controller functions, fine that work with the Kempton adapter. Of course, very rudimentary Spectrum sounds. Again, to me, I personally love these sounds. They absolutely reek in 1980s geekiness, and I love it. Sadly, the tape image crashed at the end of stage 1, so I couldn't progress into the next part of the game, which was the castle. Is this the nicest looking Spectrum game ever? No, absolutely not. But still, give it a go. Like they say, graphics isn't everything, and that's why many of us are coming back to old school gaming again. The MSX2 title was actually named as Rastan Saga, as it was originally titled for the arcades. Now, although the game plays fairly nicely and it scrolls pretty well with no choppy frame drops, the strange thing with this conversion is being single screen rather than multi-scrolling screens. The backdrops are pretty nicely animated here too. The MSX sprites used are, as can be expected, one colour with background being exposed through their bodies, kind of similar to ZX Spectrum games. The layout for this MSX2 version is also slightly different. For example, as we travel through stage 1, we have ramps where Rastan can slide and then jump. Was this really necessary? Well, not really, but I think it adds a bit more diversity to the gameplay. Music is pretty good here too. I made it past the first boss inside of the castle and can say this is definitely a major step up from most versions of this game. I was majorly impressed with this 16-bit Apple IIgs conversion. It looks great. I was playing this through a keyboard and couldn't find a button which made Rastan jump, so could only get so far within the first stage. Regardless, as we can see with the limited footage I have here, this looks incredible. Only issue is with this conversion is that it suffered dramatically with its choppiness as I'm walking around. The backgrounds and sprites are pretty much top notch and the sound is pretty special too. At some point I will be revisiting this version again, but without a doubt one of the better ports, even though it looks strange when walking along. The Sega Master System conversion is very similar to the MSX2 port. Although this game is much more refined and includes full multi-scrolling, this game also had FM sound capabilities. Out of the 50-odd Sega Master System games which supported this, the FM sound unit was mainly sold in Japan, but made games sound a little better. You can certainly hear the difference with Rastan compared with its default original sound. This game is one I had as a kid on my Sega Master System. It's a decent 8-bit console port for what it is attempting to copy, and Sega did a fairly good job of it too. It is slightly different from the arcades game, but in terms of Rastan, this was a sacrifice, and it's not like Rastan has the best bunch of home conversion ports anyways. So finally I found a version of Rastan, or rather a conversion of Rastan, that actually seemed like it cared to look like the arcade game. This is the IBM PC compatible DOS version, and this is a significantly better game than everything else here that I've covered. It copies the game to the T, and the music and sound effects also sounds really good too, and very convincing to the arcade classic game. Great sprite collision detection and a fairly challenging difficulty level with this version too. The graphics are really nicely animated, and it's just overall a very good, decent port worth playing. So if you fancy playing a port and fancy playing the best port, which is dedicated to being just like the arcade game, the DOS version without a doubt is the best one to go for here by the seams of things. So that's it for today's short video on comparing the different ports of Rastan. So you have seen some absolutely trashy, really shameful games here, but we finally got there and nailed it. That DOS does appear to be a really good version of it. So anyways, let me hear your stories. I'm sure you got some to tell in the comments section. Which version was you lumbered with growing up? Did you have the atrocious Commodore 64 version just like I did? So anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.